Story 1. It upset me. My mother had rage which she took out on all of us. Only once I was big enough to hold her hand away did she stop. I stopped her from hitting my sister. Many people are claiming they are good in this post. That's great for them. I am the reason they said no more. Story 2. Yes, I feel pretty good. No mental disorders or anything. Obviously, I did not like it as a kid, but I was not a perfect angel. My relationship with my parents now is pretty good too. Story 3. Yeah, until we got too big, my mother escalated it to slapping us in the face. It made me really resent them. Story 4. Yes, mostly when my father's rage overflowed. He was not a bad person, but he had little control over his temper in general and at one point gave me a lifelong scar accidentally. The spankings did not really change my behavior because little children are not rational actors, but they did make me vow to never be like my father. I receive regular compliments on my ability to control my temper and help others calm down when they become upset. Story 5. Yes. My poor mother regretted it so much when I was older. She apologized several times. How did it affect me? I became very Machiavellian. I avoided punishment by becoming great at manipulation and lying. Story 6. Father never touched me, but I was really scared of his booming voice alone. Mother would beat me severely, sometimes for no good reason. Edit. How did it affect me? It really messed me up. 40-odd years later, I still have flashbacks. Story 7. Yes, father had a lot of anger. Mother was some kind of twisted control enthusiast. I live 1,000 miles away from them. Story 8. Until about 5, Mom broke her hairbrush on my bottom. It gave her pause. She recalled her childhood and decided never to apply corporal punishment again. Thankfully, I found out much later as an adult what a difficult time she and her sisters went through growing up in the 1940s and 1950s. Story 9. I was born in 1948, and when I was growing up, spanking was accepted as not only normal but necessary. My father regularly beat me until I bled with a 2-inch leather belt. He beat me until I urinated on myself and often said, "I ought to beat you to death." I went to his funeral just to make sure he was dead. I must say that my father was also brutalized by his cruel mother. I did survive and eventually prospered, and I never spanked. The effects of beatings haunt me to this day. I was a forward observer in Vietnam in 1970. I was with an infantry battalion reconnaissance team and saw quite a lot of firefights. The war bothered me slightly, but not nearly as much as that leather belt and the humiliation. Story 10. Not often, but yes, I did receive a few spankings growing up. They taught me what behavior was over the limit and that there are consequences in life. Story 11. I was punished. My father beat me with a belt once. I never forgot that experience. As a result, I never raised a hand to my son, not even once. Story 12. I remember the beatings but not why I was getting them. I was taught to be respectful and mind my manners, and so were my children. I do not spank them, so yes. Story 13. Yes, they did, but only when it was warranted. It taught me respect and that actions have consequences. I was not beaten or abused, and they never did it out of anger. Story 14. I got spanked all the time, hard enough to need weeks to recover before I could return to school for reasons that, in hindsight, were completely wrong, for example, defending my brother. That being said, some of it I made worse, for example, refusing to apologize the few times I knew I was right. It hastened my exit from that house. That memory has galvanized me my entire life during hard times. It gave me the toughness to stand up to tyrant bosses and made me a better leader, more willing to stand up for his team. My coworkers always wonder how I had the courage to stand up to infamous administrators or violent people. I refused to give in to bullies. You might beat me either physically or with paperwork, but it will cost you. Story 15. Yes, and I turned out fine. No trauma. When I think back to the reasons why, I realize I actually deserved it. Story 16. It stopped scaring me, so the leather belt came out, then hitting me in the face. I do not trust many people at all anymore. Story 17. Yes, until I was maybe 9 or 10, being grounded, lectured, or feeling the disappointment was more effective. I do not have any weird feelings about it or trauma from it. I am well behaved, kind, and polite. A functional adult and a parent of children I hope will similarly become fully functioning adults and kind. Story 18. Got the belt every report card day like clockwork. In retrospect, my parents paid a lot of money for private school, and I was a lazy student. As an adult, I can see their frustration with being broke while paying for private school and having a child who was underachieving. Story 19. Yes. I was spanked and even had a wooden spoon used when spanking my butt with a hand no longer had an effect. How did it affect me? I learned what was acceptable behavior, manners, and how to respect other people and their property. Story 20. And I got hit with sticks and hangers. I would rather not think of those distressing times. Fortunately, I am no longer punished in those ways. Also, I never want to beat any of my future children, as I do not want them to suffer the way I did. Story 21. Yes, my mom spanked me for everything, almost every day. As for how it affected me, it made me fear my mom instead of love her. It taught me that when nothing else works, use violence. On the positive side, I definitely think it made me more attentive to being respectful. The thing is, that could still have been there without her hitting a child. I don't have children, but I will never spank my children when I have them. I might be open to using spanking as a last resort in extreme cases of life-threatening disobedience, but that would be rare, if ever. Story 22. Occasionally, and I am glad they did. It was never hard or hurtful. It was more of a scare tactic to help your child understand that actions have consequences. I feel like I am a better person because of it. Story 23. I received hateful abuse from my mother and stepmother. On the other hand, I received a few smacks from my dad, but it felt very different. My mother screamed, bullied, and took their rage out on me, whereas my dad had a gentle but stern conversation, explained the consequences, then hugged me and told me he loved me. I could always feel how much he hated having to discipline me. Was it still right? Maybe not. Was it better than his father's approach? Likely yes. When I think back to my childhood, I never viewed the times my dad disciplined me as harsh. Felt like discipline. We had a great bond and still do. I have no relationship with my abusive mothers, however. Story 24. I consciously remember becoming more defiant as a result. Kind of, is that the worst you can do? Coupled with getting bigger and taller than my parents at age 11 to 12, it gave me a sense of physical power over them. After that age, if I listened to what they wanted, it was a conscious choice to do so. Story 25. I received the belt. I never spanked my children or gave any form of physical discipline. Humans are the only creatures that can reason. Use it. Story 26. All the time and often exaggerated. I am pretty sure my anger issues were learned from my father. I am nowhere near as bad, but on rare occasions, I lose control. Not really at anyone though, just situations. I have mostly outgrown it. Over the years, breaking my own things in anger and frustration, only to have to replace them, helped change things. It became expensive. I learned my father was bipolar only a year before he passed, and I don't think he knew himself until shortly before I found out. Story 27. My father went beyond that. He used the belt. He did this frequently, too. He would never apologize for it either. He felt that he owed nobody an explanation for how he parented. He passed away last year. I am so glad that I do not have to be afraid of him anymore. Story 28. Yes. I have never laid a hand on either of my children, aged 28 and 14, because of it. They are both very respectful and kind boys, and I did not have to discipline them harshly for their own good to make them that way. Story 29. Spanking as a child with a switch or belt strikes after the age of 13 made me feel angry and resentful of authority in life, not just about the incident. Story 30. They did. I hated it then and now, and as a parent I vowed never to do that to my son. It is a promise I have kept. There are many better ways to discipline. Story 31. My dad spanked my sister and me. There are more issues between my father and me, but he is no longer in my life. I have chosen to move on. Story 32. Yes. My dad took it way too far, and he knew he did because he never hit me when my mom was around. He always waited until she was gone to dole out punishments. My teachers never understood why I preferred standing up or sitting in an awkward position on my chair. My mom spanked me a handful of times. I used to defend it and say I deserved it, but since having my child, I don't feel that way anymore. She only did it if I did something dangerous and foolish, such as playing with matches or throwing rocks at empty trailers, but it was never excessive to where I couldn't sit down afterward. Usually, it was 3 swats and then an hour or 2 standing with my nose in the corner. I have post-traumatic stress disorder from my dad. I wish he had been a father who was gone permanently. For the longest time, I couldn't look at or touch wooden dowels without trembling or getting flashbacks. I still don't like being around them if someone is holding one, but I'm okay holding them myself. Story 33. I was spanked, but there were definite elements that were abusive. My experience was strongly negative overall, but there were a few times I can see that I might look back on as positive if those had been the only experiences. Most of it depended on my parents' mood and had little relation to what we had done. The physical extremes were severe enough that at one point it changed drastically because they realized I should have received medical care and that the law would not look kindly on the degree of damage they were causing. There was a heavy emotional component to the abuse that was even worse. For example, I have had trouble sleeping all my life, specifically from being woken up with the buckle end of a belt. Another aspect is that I was literally the stepchild, and my half-siblings received only a tiny fraction of the abuse. Things got worse for them when I moved out, except the oldest of them stood up to it, saying, "Try it, and we are both going to the hospital, and no matter what, you are going to jail." I am 44 with children of my own who have never been spanked, and it is amazing in many ways that I never experienced challenges that were frequent in my childhood. Consistent guidance and support matter much more than the severity of consequences. That said, many times I have been tempted, and I do feel that one quick swat could have resolved a challenging situation. At least one of my nieces is also being raised in a gentle parenting household, and she is extraordinarily well behaved as well. Story 34. I was reprimanded for speaking above a whisper when someone was on the phone. I was scolded for accidentally dragging my teeth on my fork while eating or scratching the plate with a knife. I was told not to speak if there was a movie or show playing on the television. I was instructed not to walk loudly or get out of bed, even to use the bathroom. I was regularly punished for bedwetting. I was severely punished once when I did not fasten my seatbelt in the car quickly enough. I was 7 or 8 years old. I have 2 children. They are both well behaved for their respective ages, and I have never raised a hand against them, nor will I or anyone else ever do so. Story 35. No, that has thankfully been illegal in Sweden since the 1970s. We were actually the first country in the world to make such a law. The bodily autonomy and integrity of children are taken very seriously here. You might end up in prison as well as lose the right to see your child. Many other European countries have followed Sweden's example over the years, so it is now illegal in most other countries of Western, Northern, and Central Europe. To me, spanking is unquestionably child abuse, both physically and psychologically. I find the entire concept of physical punishment of children disgusting, bizarre, and barbaric. If you would not be okay with this form of physical punishment of adults, why would you ever be okay with it towards children? Story 36. Yes, it was excessive. At 25 years old, I have nightmares about my parents hitting me. Sometimes I try fighting back, but I never win. There is a lot of underlying trauma. Story 37. Yes, all I really took away from it is that when others are bigger, stronger, and older than you, you have to do whatever they say or they might hit you. I do not hit my children. I am pretty strict, but we teach everyone that violence is not the answer. I do not see how that would be a way to start a relationship with a child. My parents hit because they did not know how to teach better. I am not very close with them now. They are better people than they used to be, but I learned a lot about what not to do as well as many things they did right. I am well-adjusted and happy, but that kind of experience stays with you for life. Story 38. Yes, very rarely. I do not feel that I was abused, and it was obvious that my parents loved me, but I also would not do it to my children if I ever have any. Story 39. Rarely, but yes. All I learned was how not to get caught doing it again. It never traumatized me or anything. I still have a fairly good relationship with them. Story 40. Boards, belts, and fists from the old man, who is also a raging alcoholic. I am functioning, but it is rough. Therapy helps. Also, I am glad he died young. There is not much sadness from that. Now, no matter what, I never lay a finger on my child. Story 41. Never spanked, but beaten and concussed several times. How did it affect me? I have no idea, as I don't know any other reality. I did the self-work. That took decades, but it was worth it. I am healed, or perhaps better to say I am bent, not broken. I'm not just happy, but content. My daily mood is good. I have good relationships and I'm in love with my best friend, and she loves me back. I have golden retriever dog energy. I don't recommend trauma, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and drug addiction. I am 24 years clean now. I did the best I could, and life is good. I wouldn't change anything. Story 42. My father was pretty heavy-handed with his discipline. I was often spanked or punished for behavior and actions largely beyond my control. This, more than anything, led me to feel inadequate and unworthy of good things. My first wife was a raging narcissist, and I had no idea I deserved any better until my late 30s. Story 43. My father had absolute control over choices related to my life. He used to slap me when I was young and subjected me to verbal insults and abuse, which have significantly decreased but still continue. This resulted in a lifelong risk of life-threatening disease relapse and frequent nasty arguments, which eventually led me to take control of my life, including making my own decisions. Story 44. My mother never did. My stepfather did once, and he cried afterward, which made me feel really bad. When I moved in with my father later, he would beat me with his belt. Not in a stereotypical abusive way, but because that was how he had been raised. It was the rural South, so it was a common thing. The teachers also paddled us at school, in elementary and junior high. This was not in the 1950s or anything. I am talking about the late 1990s and early 2000s. I honestly do not think much of it. It was just the way of life in that area. I do wonder if it contributed to my issues with authority. I have a strong desire for autonomy and independence, to the point that I have avoided romantic relationships because I hate the idea of anyone dictating or controlling any aspect of my life or schedule. Story 45. Not spanking, usually slaps to the face and being made to sit in a chair thinking about what I did. I have waning motivation in life and consider myself a bad person as well as a failure. Story 46. Yes, when I was very little. It resulted in me being great in every aspect, from school to sports to relationships growing up. I was never a bad kid because I understood not to be bad. I had an amazing relationship with my parents my entire life. The key was that spanking was only done when I was a young child. It was never out of anger, and it never truly hurt. It was a shock to help show me right from wrong when I was too young to have rational conversations. By the time I was old enough, they stopped spanking me, and I stopped needing to be spanked. Story 47. It did not teach me why an action was bad. It taught me to comply with my parents only to avoid punishment. I would not consider it playing any role in the development of my personal morals. If anything, it made me resent my parents for being so unreasonable. I would say it contributed to my anger issues and aggressive compulsions because I did not learn any other way of handling conflict. I am still learning how to deal with conflict better. Story 48. No, they did not, but they punished me when I broke rules. They emphasized everyone calming down before discussing punishments. They attended several years of couples therapy and successfully stayed together early in my life. As a child, I stood in corners or went to timeout even back in the 1980s. I had some issues with authority as a teenager but found my way just fine. Story 49. Yes, I think it helped shape who I became. I have a child now and will not use the same form of discipline, but I do not hate my parents for it, nor do I have any trauma. Story 50. I got a few spankings at home and paddlings at school. I am 64 years old and so far, So good. No problems detected, and I never hated the spankers. Story 51. Yes, when necessary. It did not happen often. I grew up with manners and was polite to others. If it did, Dad would just look at me and I would feel very bad. Story 52. Yes, outside of two specific instances, I think my parents gave punishments fairly and reasonably. Pain was honestly the only punishment I felt actually deterred me, but like all other punishments, it taught me more how to avoid getting caught than to avoid doing bad things. Story 53. I was spanked and screamed at all the time. I did not think it affected me much into adult life, but recently, at almost 40, I saw some home videos that brought it all back. I realized I probably have a lot to work through. Story 54. My mom used to spank me when I made mistakes. I don't think my dad ever did. It stopped when I put on my big Western belt backwards because I knew I was going to get one. She ended up breaking a finger. Story 55. My dad administered the spankings. I remember being chased around the dinner table until I was cornered with chairs multiple times. I also remember being held up against the wall by my throat, but I still cannot remember what caused that reaction. I think it finally stopped when I ran to the kitchen during dinner and went into the drawer with the big cooking knives, only for my dad's hand to grab mine before I could take one. I never properly processed this event until recently, when confronting my own anger issues. I am pretty sure they thought I was going to grab the knife to hurt someone, but in reality, I wanted to plunge the knife into myself. I couldn't take how it was okay for my sister to laugh and tease me about my stutter, and everyone would find it funny. This was also after I had experienced some pretty jarring events. If anyone can figure out who I am sorry for being so scary and lashing out. Story 56. My parents would take turns whipping me and my brother for things that were beyond our control. They whipped me for bedwetting, which was caused by the stress I had to endure, including both the whipping and abuse in general. In their minds, I did it on purpose. Yes, I wake up at night and wet the bed, because who would not like the discomfort of wet sheets? They would whip me for breaking a cup. What kind of lesson is that? To be afraid to make a mistake or an accident because both resulted in punishment. I will never forgive them. Story 57. My parents disciplined me by hand over trousers until around 10 o'clock. I do not resent them for it. I will say I have a spanking fetish. Story 58. It ruined my whole life. I could write 1,000 words easily. I don't know, maybe write a novel. Do not hit your children, everyone. Story 59. Yes, my mom spanked me with a leather belt almost every day. By today's standards, I experienced verbal, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual abuse. The spankings were just a normal aspect of my life. I didn't know any different. Initially, I learned to avoid and fear my mom. Unconsciously, I became hyper-aware, sensitive, and tuned in to people, situations, and environments around me as a mechanism for survival and safety. I also learned to hide, deny, feel shame, fear, and doubt myself. As a child, I would do everything to avoid being spanked. It never changed, and I assumed that I was the problem. I was raised in a cult-like religion which helped reinforce this belief. There was a point where I thought, maybe she's doing this for herself, not because of me. I decided to test it by changing my typical response. The next time, I didn't resist, protest, cry, make a sound, or even move when spanked. This happened a few more times with a little less frequency. She would spank me and I wouldn't respond at all. Then there was an incident. She went to slap my face, which was not uncommon. However, in an instant and without thinking, I grabbed her forearm, holding it in place. She tried to break my hold, yelled, and threatened violent retaliation. I calmly looked at her and really looked at her. I didn't move or respond. She met my gaze. I released her and, without words or emotion, communicated that she would never slap me again. I didn't care if she spanked me, and I expected it in that moment. She did not. She walked away, and that was the end of it. I was around 10 years old at the time. As I developed, grew, and had my own children and relationships, I found that being spanked taught me a lot of positive things and helped shape me. It gave me strength, character, knowledge, understanding, confidence, wisdom, and motivation. A couple of examples. It helped me find effective, nonviolent disciplinary solutions for my own children. I learned that forgiveness doesn't require anyone else, doesn't need to be explained or justified, and doesn't require a confession or apology. I learned to forgive for myself, my own peace, closure, and happiness. I could go on for days, but let's leave it at that. Story 60. Yes, I got beatings with a belt. But sometimes my father got so violent that he dropped the belt, put his knees in my stomach, and his hands around my throat to choke me as punishment. So yeah, it definitely left some trauma. Story 61. Yes, I became an angry, violent person. I was very angry, mostly at my parents, but also internally because I could not express it by fighting at school. All that anger built up and made me try to end my life a few times. I still hate that my parents hurt their children. That is not fair. Story 62. My mom did. I always thought my dad was on board, but he was usually working when she did it. At 34, I was just talking with him and I mentioned the spankings. His face went pale, then red. He doesn't believe in hitting kids. He was born in 1950, and his parents never hit him. Mom got a talking to, but it's not like he's someone who would hit her. Story 63. I once threw a rock at my father out of anger, and he beat me severely with his belt. From that point on, anytime I would act up, he would give me a look as if he was going to get the belt, and I would correct my behavior quickly. That one beating truly humbled me, and I turned out just fine. I love him dearly. God rest his soul. Story 64. The guest I fit beat with a belt. I was 3 years old. It scarred me in ways that I am still unwinding 40 years later. Story 65. My mom would spank me, and I remember her slapping me across my face a few times when I was older. She was a single parent, and I was an only child, so I understand she had a lot of pressure and how difficult it was to raise me. It did not affect me at all, but if I ever have children, I doubt I would discipline them in that way. I believe it is not necessary and can make you fear your parents. Story 66. Yes. It taught me that hitting children is wrong and just lazy parenting. When I had my own children, I made it clear that if one of them ever laid a finger on my children, they would never see them or me again. Both my parents are dead now, and I never forgave them. Story 67. I remember the pain, humiliation, and fear. It made me afraid of my mother for decades. I have never raised a hand to my own children. I have talked and explained instead, not yelled. My children tell me about their mistakes and ask for advice on fixing them. They trust me because of this and are remarkably well behaved. Story 68. Yes, they did. It was common in the Philippines. It was not just hands, belt, T-square, walking stick, broomstick. I cannot really say how it affected me. Maybe it is the reason why I am still single. Could it be because I am afraid of what would happen when I become a parent? Story 69. Dad was a proponent of spanking. Really, though, he believed in "you're my property, and I do what I want when my property vexes me." Mom used healthier physical punishment. Really, though, she assaulted us as a means to try to teach him that she was on his side. But maybe it didn't have to be as rage-born as he felt it needed to be. You could beat your kids in the name of love, she insisted, until she was afraid. Story 70. I was hit daily with hands, belts, and cooking utensils. It taught me that reacting with explosive anger and violence was parenting. Took a conscious choice on my part, combined with years of therapy, to break the cycle. Story 71. Yes, sometimes worse. I really don't respect my father. As a father, if I were to hit my children for any reason, I would feel terrible. I definitely don't want to teach my children that it is acceptable for adults to hit them, because that is what I learned from it. My father does not think it is okay if I slap him around, so I don't know why it would be acceptable for parents to hit children. Story 72. I turned out to be one of the most well-behaved and good kids possible. Discipline can be achieved in many ways. Beating someone is not one of them. Story 73. No, and I am glad I was not. If you need physical discipline to teach your child that something is not acceptable, you are not an effective communicator. Story 74. Yes, it made me fear my father. As a parent, I think parents who beat or spank their child use it as a crutch to get immediate results rather than teaching natural consequences, or who do not even know there are better alternatives. Story 75. I have resentment toward everyone who perpetrated violence against me as a child. My father, teachers, priests, and even kids who picked fights. Anytime I think of the whippings from my father, a tiny bit of hate bubbles up. That cannot be healthy. I outwardly forgave, but inwardly the poison still permeates. Story 76. Yes, all the time. How did it affect me? Well, for most of my life, I would say, my parents spanked me and I turned out just fine. And for the most part, I did. Sure, I partied a lot in my teens and 20s, but I eventually got my life together. But I'll say this too. I never really felt all that close to my parents. My mom died when I was about 17, and I left home shortly after that. While my dad and I had a good enough relationship until he died a few years ago, it was never what I would call close. We did not do much together as men. I'll also point out that even though my parents physically disciplined me growing up and I turned out fine, I have never once considered raising my hands to my own son. He is 14 years old now and a fairly typical teenage kid. The big difference between him and me at that age is that he actually encourages me to do things with him. Sure, I have played video games with him since he was old enough to hold a controller. I bought him a special kid-sized controller for the computer. I taught him and his friends how to play Dungeons and Dragons. I have taken him to retro video game conventions, comic book conventions, science fiction conventions, and even took him to see classic punk bands when they came through town on their 40th anniversary tours. Despite the fact that I actually think that stuff is uninteresting, I suppose that is a big part of why he likes hanging out with me these days. However, the fact that I never spanked him is probably the bigger factor. Story 77. Yes, it taught me power is absolute. The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. Story 78. I was only spanked as a last resort. I developed a close relationship with my parents. I believe that children need a certain amount of challenge to become functional adults in society. Nowadays, children often lack basic respect for others and impulse control. This is not solely caused by devices and internet use. It is also due to a lack of real consequences. A certain amount of fear of authority figures is essential. You need to understand the consequences of your negative actions. This is a form of basic behavioral reinforcement. Of course, corporal punishment can be taken too far or used excessively. When applied appropriately, I believe it is effective. Story 79. When I was little, yes. Once I was older than about 10, spankings turned into fists. I am not communicating with Dad, and the rest of my family is at arm's length. I have completely withdrawn from extended family and live a very private life. Story 80. I was physically disciplined several times when I was a child but not spanked. I wish I had been spanked instead. It sounds much less painful, and I have a vivid memory that hasn't forgotten any pain I endured since I was 11 months old. Honestly, considering I went through a few other horrible things in my childhood too, I cannot say what caused some uncommon characteristics and tendencies that exist in me and define me. Story 81. Recent studies have shown that corporal punishment causes changes in the brain similar to physical abuse. Story 82. I was spanked until around 7 years old, only on the buttocks, strictly for discipline. Not for any other reason. As a child, it made me behave. As an adult, I have no trauma related to it, and I am completely fine knowing it happened to me. Story 83. Yes, it was never abusive or malicious. I definitely deserved it at the time. I grew up to be respectful, respect boundaries, and have an amazing relationship with my parents. Story 84. Yes. I learned that power can be abused and that abuse is widespread. My father died, and I regret not being able to tell him to go away before he passed. My stepmother will be dead soon. Nothing of value was lost. Story 85. No, but my parents just had to look at me slightly disapprovingly and I would be in tears and terribly apologetic for whatever it was, even if I did not think I had anything to do with it. I cannot imagine spanking would have added much to it. However, I was a terrible eater at about 3 years old and literally would faint when my parents tried to outlast me and I still refused to eat. Eventually, they had to start force-feeding me. It was for my own good but was physically traumatizing all the same and had to happen 3 times a day for hours because I was so slow. Story 86. I am surprised at the number of parents who cannot teach their children about consequences without resorting to physical punishment. Story 87. I wasn't a bad child, so I didn't get punished often, but I was also a smartass. Spankings? They pulled my pants down, and I bent over and said, "Go for it." Wash my mouth out with soap? I took a bite out of a bar and chewed it. My punishments became forced hard labor at a very young age. Story 88. Yes. I would say the only way it affected me was that I learned when to listen. It was never extreme but enough to remind me who makes the rules. Now, as an adult, I see children running wild and their parents practicing passive parenting or hands-off parenting, whatever it is called. Those children need discipline. The biggest issue I see with hands-off parenting is that your wild child now becomes everyone else's problem in public because you are not able to manage your own child. Story 89. Yes, but I do not think it negatively affected me in any way except rarely and only when I did over-the-top stuff. Story 90. Yes, and it taught me 3 things. 1. I am never doing that to my child. Do not associate with people who are violent toward children or people in general. People will defend violence against children as long as you use discipline as an excuse. I do not associate with these kinds of people either. I also do not talk to my father anymore, but there are additional reasons for that. Story 91. Not spanked, beaten, or punched. I grew up a shy, reclusive kid. It caused me to have an explosive temper. I broke my hands 5 times punching walls and car windshields. I wouldn't let people in or get close and did not want to be touched. It took me a long time to deal with it, and I am still dealing with it at times. Older generations born before the 1990s were hit too much. Today's kids are not hit enough. Story 92. I learned to run and fight. Dad had to punish me with his hand or belt. It was not unusual for my brother or me to be bruised. Story 93. Somehow, I ended up getting into physical altercations every time I had a problem with literally anything when I was a kid. Story 94. Yes, spanking occurred when doing wrong. I was told no, and I did it, so spanking taught me discipline, respect for myself, and how to behave like a man. Sometimes a child will test dad for respect. If dad does not hold his ground, the child will have less respect going forward. Story 95. It was fine in my experience. For some reason, after a while it did not hurt and I just began laughing like a psycho when spanking was due. So my mom realized it did not bother me. No trauma whatsoever. I have a good relationship with my mom. All is fine. Story 96. No. I was never spanked and frankly, I turned out better than about 95% of people I know who like to say, I got spanked as a kid and I turned out fine. Story 97. Yes. It wasn't extreme, but it was almost entirely unnecessary. I had undiagnosed autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and although I did really well at school, I did get in trouble for speaking out of turn. Teachers would beat us as well. I don't hate my father, but I think I learned early on that I couldn't really trust him. My relationship with him is strained to this day. I am 47. I made a point of being a better father to my son, who is almost 16. I have never spanked him, and I am extremely proud of the man he is becoming. Someone kind and compassionate with whom I can have long and meaningful conversations. He lives with his mother, and I see him about once a week, plus during holidays. Every time I see him, his face lights up, and I feel genuine love from him and towards him. Story 98. A few times. It just made me resentful toward my dad. My relationship with him is fine these days, but we are not exactly close. I was the black sheep due to a few mental health issues that were not properly diagnosed until I finished my undergraduate studies. I am doing okay these days. Story 99. Yes. I never liked it. Even to this day, 40 years later, it saddens and angers me that my parents were violent with me. Story 100. To those of you who think physical punishment did you a favor, the physical punishment did not make you a better person. You are a better person despite it. Many more people feel the negatives than those who are unaffected. Story 101. My parents spanked me, but it was not excessive. I learned that committing a crime was not worth the punishment. In the future, I will spank my children. Story 102. Yes, it caused me trauma and a large therapy bill when I entered my 20s. Parents who spank their children should be immediately referred to Child Protective Services. Story 103. Yes, although many were crude and not appropriate as a punishment, that was not what affected how I feel about them. I view spankings as normal and it worked, so I am not upset about that. It was mostly the yelling and not allowing me to be myself that makes me dislike them. Story 104. Yes, only mom hit us, and I do think it helped shape me into the person I am today. However, the older I get, the more I learn about human-child development. I have learned how unprepared and emotionally immature my mother really was and still is. My mom would hit me under the guise of discipline for being a mischievous and rambunctious child. It is easy to see that I was just a kid with a lot of personality and energy. Would I hit my kids? 100% no. Story 105. They beat the brakes off my ass when it was warranted, and I completely deserved it because I was a tough little kid. Story 106. Occasionally, not very often. It is hard to say how it affected me specifically, but plenty of research shows it affects brain development and attachment. Story 107. If you consider it assault for someone to hit you to teach you a lesson, then hitting your children is assault too, especially young children. You are everything to them, and do you want part of that everything to be pain and violence? Story 108. Yes, I was disciplined 4 or 5 times a day until I turned 13. It made me a fairly disciplined person as opposed to the chaotic individual I used to be. Story 109. I got hit with a stick. It only raised me in a household based on fear. I do not hit my children because I do not think it is effective. It is just a knee-jerk reaction when you are upset as a parent. I am more interested in understanding why my children made the decisions they did. I suppose the analogy is like yelling at an uninformed person for being uninformed. Yelling does not solve anything. Story 110. No, and I am familiar enough with the research documenting how ineffective it is that I consider such forms of discipline to be child abuse. Story 111. Children who are spanked have lower test scores and lower intelligence quotients in general. I was not just spanked growing up, but was also whipped with a belt. Story 112. Does everyone who advocates their parents using physical violence against them and claims to be fine hit their child and think it is acceptable? Just curious. Story 113. I used to think it was abuse. Technically, I was, but seeing how kids are turning out today, I am thankful. My mom was harsh and had no problem reminding me that she not only disliked children, but was not a fan of me personally. However, I would rather go through what I did and turn out respectful, have good manners, and not hesitate to stand up for myself if needed. It seems kids today do not respect boundaries, lack education, and chase clout with no goals in sight. Also, it was not the violence that affected me, but the brutal words. Story 114. Yes, I did not repeat my mistakes and turned out just fine. No severe mental illnesses or inability to live life. Story 115. Yes, in the stores too. I do not have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I do not act disrespectfully in public. So I guess it worked for me. My skin is thicker than a wet paper bag, unlike this generation. Story 116. Yes, I learned not to be disrespectful and to obey their rules. I learned that my actions had consequences and that was not abstract. Story 117. I made every mistake mostly twice because the second time I was punished. After that, I never did it again. Story 118. Yes, they did, and it was not without reason. I was not spanked without cause. When I was spanked, it was because I could have seriously harmed myself. Story 119. I used to get a light tap to the back of the head, not hard but just enough to give me a fright. It was very rare and worked every time. Story 120. Yes, often. Although it is normal in my country of Mexico, I think it helped at times. I remember running for my life around the house as my mom or dad chased me with a belt. I would be crying and screaming at them not to hit me. They would always catch me in a corner. Of course, it all stops once you get past a certain age. Story 121. Yes, but it was nothing like their parents did. No belts or wooden spoons. I can't even remember being put over a knee. Just two sharp slaps to the butt and off to the corner with me. As for how it affected me, no trauma or anything if that is what you mean. If I ever got swatted or sent to the corner, it was because I got a little too big for my britches. Story 122. My sister and I were never hit by our parents. We were in a constant battle for years. Our parents did get angry but never raised a hand against us. I remember one time when we were fighting about something and making a lot of noise, Mum came barging into the room and had a screaming session. She clearly wanted to take it out on us and hit us, but instead she decided to have a one-on-one fight with the closest chair. We watched her slap it, scream at it, and slap it some more. She pushed the chair and it fell to the ground. She gave it a few kicks, picked it up, and continued to slap it. All this while, my sister and I watched with amazement. We looked at each other and started laughing so hard I felt like I was about to faint. Story 123. My dad did, mostly when my brother and I stayed up playing instead of sleeping. It happened most nights. We didn't stop until we got separate bedrooms. I don't think it affected us that much. I don't flinch when I see a wooden spoon or yardstick. Pulling a belt off quickly and snapping it doesn't trigger fight or flight mode. In fact, I joke about how much my mom yelled at him for breaking her mixing spoons. Story 124. When I was a child, it was conditioning. I learned not to do certain things. I think it was actually good. Story 125. My twin and I were spanked minimally, but we were both, in my mom's words, good kids. My little brother is on the autism spectrum, and neither my mom nor my dad touched him. The times I was spanked, once with a wooden spoon, were for either blatant disrespect of rules or doing something legitimately damaging to property or persons. In any case, I knew what I was doing was wrong. The spanking ceased around age 11. I think using this tactic with my own children would depend on whether I believe they would respond to that form of punishment and if the bad behavior required that level of discipline. Story 126. Yes. We lived in a two-story home, and the bedrooms were upstairs. The belt was hung on one of the banister supports where we were told to go get it for a spanking. I honestly do not remember it affecting me. Story 127. Twice I got spanked as a kid. Both times I definitely deserved it. It taught a valuable lesson about the consequence of actions, and that is it. Story 128. My dad spanked me one time that I can remember, and I deserved it. He was backing out of a stall in a parking garage after taking my sister and me to see Disney on Ice. He bumped a pillar, damaging the truck, which was my uncle's. My sister and I kept laughing and teasing him, so he reached around and slapped our thighs a few times. We cried. That's it. It's pretty funny looking back, so nothing really major. Story 129. I did deserve it, and honestly, if they had not taught me a lesson, someone else would have, and it would have been much worse. Story 130. Twice, for flooding the bathroom floor and setting off fireworks in my room. It turned out fine, and I am on good terms with my father. Story 131. Mom would double up the vacuum cleaner cord and whoosh it on the back of my legs, sometimes the belt, sometimes those really skinny branches from a tree that would not break because of how moist the tree was, always on the back of the legs. Sometimes she would lock me in the gloomy basement. Not for long, though. I came out fine. She, on the other hand, has and always will continue to battle her demons. Dad never laid a finger on us. Story 132. Yes, very infrequently, only when I was being a particularly difficult child. I don't think it affected me at all. I grew up to be a perfectly functional adult. I haven't spanked my daughter. In that regard, she is in far more danger from my wife, who was spanked much more as a child and is much more vulnerable to our child's button pushing. Story 133. Yes, many times. Most of my friends and cousins or siblings experienced it growing up. We are all mostly well-adjusted adults who know right from wrong and have decent empathy. I could not imagine ever being rude to someone, for example, in my parents' presence, even though I am a grown man, but not out of fear. Many children had it much worse than we did, and there are many parents who go too far. Story 134. The occasional spanking with reason, always followed by a conversation and a hug afterward. I turned out pretty well. My parents and I are on good terms. Story 135, yes, pretty frequently. The problem was, I did not learn from it. I do not have trauma per se. I do think it helped me in the long run when I had to learn how to function in society. I knew my rights from wrongs. However, I do not think spanking should be the primary method for disciplining a child. The only times I feel it is warranted are when the child is intentionally violent towards another person. Talk disrespectfully, face consequences. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.